Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel, Building Our Way to a Robust 5G Future, with the dawn of the 5G era upon us. Densification is the word of the day, and we've got a panel of experts here to talk about all the challenges and opportunities that face us as we forge ahead and in this new era, building out 5G networks. I'm getting my questions out.
I was hoping to start with some warm-up jokes.
They're coming, don't worry. Let me introduce the panel. To my left, the Chief of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau at the FCC, Don Stockdale. Charles McKee from Sprint, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs. From Verizon, Tamara Preiss. Everyone's a vice president of something like federal affairs, so I'm going to skip the specifics. Is that all right? Carlson from Ericsson, and Andy Huckaba, who is not a vice president. He is city councilman from Lenexa, Kansas, and president of Huckaba and Associates. I think I have that right. Very good. Well, welcome, folks. Let me start with our private sector folks. Everybody's making announcements these days, and Tamara and Charles, your companies have made announcements about commitments to start rolling out 5G within the next year. Can you just give us an update on your deployment plans and any of the other announcements you want to highlight for our crowd?
Sure. You want to go first?
Sure. Happy to go first. Thanks for having me, Tom. I'm happy to talk about infrastructure. I feel like I don't ever talk about anything else these days. So I'm hoping everyone has heard Verizon's latest announcement, because we have tried to inundate all of you with it while we've been here. I've seen new commercials, I've seen new posters, we announced this week that we're open for business with our 5G home product. We had announced earlier in the year we were going to offer that in 4 cities this year. We open for business today, able to start placing your orders. Operators are standing by, if you'd like to call. It has to be done online, so that's a little bit of a metaphor there. And then starting to install the service October 1st. And that will be here in Los Angeles, in Sacramento, in Houston, and Indianapolis, and then we'll follow with other cities in 2019. So that's the latest and greatest from Verizon, and we're very excited that it's actually coming to pass. We can stop talking about 5G and doing it.
That's right. I think that's one of the exciting things about this show and what you can see out on the floor. If you haven't had a chance to do it, I would encourage you guys to come by the Sprint booth and take a look at what we have on the floor there, because what you'll see are the equipment actually operating, and you'll see that this is no longer just talk and vaporware. These are actually pieces of equipment that are getting installed today. So Sprint's taking a slightly different approach to the way in which we're deploying 5G. We're focusing on a mobile 5G play. And the way we're going to launch that is through what we call the Massive MIMO, which is a great name that really doesn't convey much to you, but they are really cool devices. And like I say, I encourage you to look at the booth, but you'll see that they are these boxes with rows and rows of little squares, and you'd think, what are those little squares for? And each one of them is an antenna. In fact, each of those squares is 2 antennae. So there are 128 antennae in this little box that will go on our macro cell sites. And the beauty of those devices is that they can be both LTE and 5G. So as they're going up today, they're being installed today, and we're going to continue that deployment through next year. And in the beginning of 2019, we will turn those radios over to the 5G operating system. And in conjunction with that, we've also announced the launch of the first 5G-enabled handset that we're doing in conjunction with LG. So through that combination, in the beginning of next year, you will have opportunity to actually be using 5G in the real world, which I think is really cool after the number of panels we've done on 5G.
It's here.
Great to actually have it coming in.
Jared, how about from Ericsson's perspective? You guys have been making your own announcements and a big splash on some R&D investment you're going to be doing. Give us the update from Ericsson's perspective, and talk about how, from the vendor perspective, these issues affect your company.
Sure, happy to. Thanks. So we just announced, just in the last few weeks, that we are bringing production of 5G devices to the U.S. In addition to a lot more R&D, jobs as well. We're actually going to start producing radios by the end of the year in the U.S. And in large part, that's to get us closer to the customers, to be able to respond quickly to their needs. 5G moves pretty quickly, and the idea is to get our product design as out there and as ready to deploy as possible. And naturally, one aspect is the aesthetic considerations, and so that's another advantage to be able to produce things in the U.S. is to take those demands into account. Standardization is key to what we do. We try to do as much as we can to keep things using same spectrum, same housing for our radios as much as we can in the 180 countries that we do business in. So, from our perspective, that's what the difference in municipalities has on the effect it has on us is having to make adaptations to thousands, tens of thousands of different areas in the U.S.
So, Andy, you're on the front lines of this as much as anyone. But I did a little homework. Andy's a city councilman from Lenexa, Kansas. I like to know who I'm talking to. So, Lenexa is about 50,000 people?
55.
Yeah, about 15 miles from Kansas City?
Correct.
Right. One of its original residents was Wild Bill Hickok. Is that right?
True.
Yep. And for the foodies out there, you can go in June for the Great Lenexa Barbecue Battle.
Correct.
Or in September, just last weekend, was the Spinach Festival. Is that right?
Yeah.
And the spinach is just to atone for the barbecue, I'm guessing?
Yeah, I think something like that.
Yeah.
It's the
Well, anyway.
city of festivals. I mean, quite a few of them.
So presumably you want your residents to have all the benefits of 5G as soon as possible, but you're also responsible for overseeing the rights of way. So you're serving a couple different interests there. But let's just focus on the first part. What is exciting about 5G for you as a representative of the city? And do you think the industry's done a good enough job of sort of conveying that narrative of what 5G really means for a city?
Well, so I can speak for myself, and then I can speak for other council people around the country. I would say that industry probably hasn't done a great job in having that direct communication with councils so that they understand what this is really about. Now, I have a window into it because of my work with the FCC, the BDAC, and the Intergovernmental Advisory. And I'm excited about the speed. I'm excited about the capacity. I'm excited about the innovation that's possible because of the speed and the capacity. I think that our cities, we're in a competitive environment too, it turns out, especially in a metropolitan area, where we have to compete for residents and businesses all the time with all of our neighbors. So we're in a metropolitan area in Kansas City of 2.8 million, give or take a few one way or the other. And very large land mass and a lot of cities that are involved in it. And, companies want to go where they can get their work done in the best way. People want to live where they have the amenities that keep them there and that help them. And one of those amenities is high-speed broadband. And we have a lot of fiber in Lenexa. We have lots of options. And oddly enough, there's still holes. And so some of the promises here, some of the things I'm excited about is filling those gaps. And I think we have an opportunity to do that.
So let's take the other side of the equation now and start talking about a few of the things the FCC has done this year or is looking to do. And I'll stay with you, Andy. And I'll start with what I think is a simple one. In August, the Commission issued a declaratory ruling saying that moratoria on wireless deployments are prohibited by the Communications Act. Is that reasonable to you?
Well, so Charles and I have had this battle for the past year, and it's been rather delightful, actually.
Good-spirited fun.
It's been good-spirited fun because the concept of moratorium, I don't know our audience whether you have a real good idea what this is about in terms of local government, but there are times where something occurs or something comes to the forefront where we need a breath, we need a pause to understand how to deal with it. Unfortunately, there are bad players out there who have used it in other ways where they have, it's not been as justifiable and it's not been short-term, it's been long-term, and so it's kept businesses or buildings or other types of things out of their communities on purpose. We look at moratoria as a tool, but one that ought to be used very sparingly, and it really sends an awfully tough signal out to industry, and it's a signal that we really don't want to send. And so from our standpoint in Lenexa, moratoria is something that we really try to avoid. This order of just saying, well, you can't do it, probably, for the most part, it's not going to affect us that much, but when there are cases where brand new stuff is charging down the path, the freight train's coming, right, and you don't know how to deal with it, there might be times when there's a need for a little breath to figure that out. And I think the front end of the 5G deployment may be one of these times, and so I think removing that ability, we're going to have to figure out another way to catch our breath and figure out the best types of policies to work with. And I think we're going to need industry's partnership in doing this.
So let's fast forward to what's on the horizon. We just heard Commissioner Carr talking about the item that is pending before the commissioners now. He went out to Indianapolis last week to announce it. A lot in there. Don, do you want to take a cut at just telling the crowd the highlights?
Well, Commissioner Carr actually did a better job than I think I will be able to do, but I will try to summarize it. The item consists of both a declaratory ruling and a report and order. The declaratory ruling interprets Section 253 and 332C7 of the Act, which basically preempt state and local legal requirements that prohibit or have the effect of prohibiting the provision of a telecommunication or personal wireless service. And so in this declaratory ruling, we interpret that statutory language. We reaffirm what is the standard that the Commission adopted in the California payphone decision, which said that if a legal requirement materially limits or impairs the ability of a competitor or potential competitor to compete in a fair and balanced legal and regulatory environment, it's a prohibition that is preempted. So we reaffirm that standard. We then go on to address regulatory fees, and we find that these fees are prohibitions unless they are reasonable approximations, excuse me, reasonable approximations of objectively reasonable costs. So it's basically a cost-based standard. The item then goes on to provide certain safe harbors where municipalities, if they establish fees at or below those levels, will be presumed to be reasonable. So that's, and then as Commissioner Carr addressed, the declaratory ruling also goes on to address certain non-fee restrictions and in particular aesthetic requirements, and finds that they will be permissible if they're reasonable, non-discriminatory, and publicly announced. And then in the third report and order, we go on to address shot clocks and establish 2 new shot clocks for small cells for 60 and 90 days. We codify existing shot clocks that were established in 2009 for macro cells and non-small cell deployments. And we find that, or address what are called batch applications, which are basically the fact that with these new 5G small cell deployments, it is really the only practicable for carriers to submit batches of dozens or hundreds of applications at a single time, because they can only really deploy if they can deploy a sort of network of small cells. So that's the
Great.
basics of that item.
Charles, preliminary thoughts on that?
Well, we think it's great. That's a fabulous order. I think the commission is taking the right approach here. We recognize that we're going to have to work in partnership with the cities, but we also need to have some guidance to help structure the way in which we approach cities. Every carrier is going to have to be densifying their networks, and this is a difficult process in the United States. Obviously, the way in which we're structured, there are thousands, tens of thousands of municipalities, and we have to have some way of managing deployments on a large scale, and we think that the FCC has struck a good balance here in providing some guidelines with still allowing for flexibility and an acknowledgement that we are going to have to continue to work cooperatively with cities.
Tamara, what jumps out at you from the item? Anything in particular?
Oh, we think it's a great order, great draft order, and we hope it's adopted, pretty much as written now. The FCC has done a lot of hard work here. I think what jumps out at me, because people get very excited about the P word and preemption, and it's the FCC intruding into local business that it has no business getting into. I think you can look at what the order does and what the order doesn't do. The FCC was trying to do a pretty difficult thing, strike a balance between a national policy to promote 5G for all the reasons Commissioner Carr outlined just a few minutes ago, that the U.S. wants to win the race to 5G, and a lot of good things in terms of investment and jobs will come from that if we succeed, as we did with 4G. But everything is local. As Charles has said, we've got tens of thousands of localities, and they have legitimate interests in what's going up in their communities, what they look like, who's there, and what services are providing. So the FCC doesn't want to step on toes too much. So in one sense, you could say the order does a lot. It says that local fees can inhibit provision of service and therefore trigger the possibility of preemption under federal law. It adopts presumptively reasonable rates for localities to charge, and that's something new. It adopts shorter shot clocks for small cells. It says some things about aesthetics, generally deferring to localities on that. But what doesn't it do? It doesn't preempt anything right out the door. It says, okay, your rates, localities can recover their costs, and we're not going to do a full-blown cost case here. What we are doing is going to look at 20 states that passed small cell legislation, look at the rates that are in that legislation, and adopt presumptively reasonable safe harbors that are at the high end of those. I mean, a lot of the state legislation rates about $100, not, for instance, the $270 that's in the order. So they're giving a cushion there for recognizing the work that states have done, giving a cushion to localities, and even those are just presumptive. A locality can come in and say, we're charging this higher rate because that is a cost-based rate for us, and they have the opportunity to do that. So again, they're trying to establish a baseline or guidelines, whatever you want to call it, but also leaving some room for flexibility, I think is how you put it, Charles. Same with the shot clocks. Industry, Verizon, we asked for a deemed granted remedy. We're not getting one. So again, the day a shot clock expires, nothing happens. If it comes down to litigation, and quite honestly, we don't like to be suing cities that we see as our customers, but if it came down to litigation, any locality will have the opportunity to demonstrate that it needed more time because of the scope of the applications, the number, the scale, all that. So again, nothing is automatic. So I think the FCC was trying very carefully to follow the lead of the states who have done the hard work of modernizing their siting practices to recognize that small cells are not macro cells, and you just need a new way of looking at things without stepping on too many toes and leaving a considerable flexibility for the localities.
And Andy, you're good with it, right?
Well, so it's kind of interesting, and that I think some pieces of it are pretty good. Commissioner Carr made a very noble statement when he talked, and I hope that this statement actually is true. And that is that if we take costs out of the administrative side or the permitting and rental side, in the more dense areas, that deployment will happen more easily in the less dense areas. Our experience has not actually made that a solid argument, but it's a very noble argument, and I'd like to see it happen, actually. It's just that what we see is the providers are going to go in the area where they can make money. And the areas where they can't make money, they're going to be looking for subsidies of some type to get there. And I don't think this cause and effect of lowering the rates necessarily will cause the rest of the 24 million people who don't have broadband today to have broadband tomorrow. So that's kind of an interesting argument, and it's one that I struggle with just a little bit. The elephant in the room, and has been in the room ever since we started the BDAC work, has been rates and fees. And I think I called it out in one meeting and got dubbed chair of the Rates and Fees Committee, and that's kind of funny how that works. Jonathan Adelstein, where are you? You're back there somewhere, right? And Jonathan worked side by side with me along with some wonderful people, to go through this whole concept of rates and fees and what this looks like. And ultimately, we did not recommend a number, which I think disappointed some people. But we knew, number one, if we threw a number out there, the first thing people would do is shoot at it and beat it up and tear it up. And that's going to happen with this ruling as well. The idea that the cost to do applications, regardless of where you are in the country and what the conditions are, all going to be $100 is a silly thing. In some places it might be 25, and some places it might be 500 in reality. And so setting that mark of $100 is kind of an arbitrary number, and it's going to be very, very difficult to work within that. Now, the reality is that cities want to see cost recovery, right? We want to make sure that when the private industry comes in to use the public infrastructure and the public right-of-way, that they pay for what it takes to use that. And when they don't, that it becomes an unfunded mandate for cities. And this is what this means. It means that cities have to allocate funds from other parts of their budget to pay for this implementation when these costs don't even out. And that means we have to take money away from other services like public safety and so forth, and that's a big deal. And so we're very concerned about that, and we start to take a look at these rates of $100 and $270 and say, are these really the right numbers? Or should we go on a set of principles like we talked about in the Rates and Fees Committee and report, that began to run down a list of principles that everybody in the room agreed with and said, why don't we use these principles as a golden criteria to begin to establish what reasonable rates really look like? And when I ran these rates through that, and this was Andy's filter, we were good on 5 of the 7. The 2 that we weren't good on was the fairness to both sides thing, because of what I just said about cost being uneven and so forth. And the other one was the future looking, that when you establish a set rate, that's not a very future looking type of thing, and anytime you do that within rules or legislation, you end up being sorry that you set that one rate, because it is not future looking. Our world changes very rapidly, things change, and those rates may actually go down in the future. It's hard to tell. But setting that is not future looking, and so we lost on those 2 things when we look at our golden criteria for setting rates of fees.
To Tamara's point, though, these are presumptions, right?
Yeah.
You can charge more. And
I would refer to them as safe harbors.
safe harbors, thank you. Are you generally, though, are comfortable with cost-based as being the right approach? We can argue what the costs are, but...
Yeah, well, and so I don't want to dominate the discussion up here, obviously. But I would say that we, as a Rates and Fees Committee, said that costs ought to be the basis for, direct costs ought to be the basis for any type of permitting work. it's what it takes to do those permits. That ought to be what's charged. Very simple. When you start to take a look at the rental rates on poles, and so one thing I did like about the order is they took our structure of the 3 different costs areas. One would be one-time fee, one would be rental rates, and one would be right-of-way fees, right? But the thing that I didn't like is they basically said, well, all fees are the same. And they're not all the same. And they're not all done the same, and they're not all used the same, and the impact on the community and the infrastructure and so forth is not the same. And so you can't just wave a wand and say these are all the same, and they're not. And so you'll get pushback from cities on especially that part of the order. And when you start to take a look at the right-of-way, you start to look at the degradation of the pavement and all sorts of other things that truly do happen, and there are lots of statistics that show that. Can those be rolled into the cost part of it? If they can, then we're probably okay. But if they can't, if it's only the burden that that particular application made, then it may be a challenge to make it come out even for the cities.
Tamara, you mentioned the deemed granted issue, and this was, some in the industry had asked that if a municipality exceeds the shot clock, then the application is just deemed granted. That's not quite where the commission came out. They said that it was presumptively, it was a presumptive prohibition
Prohibition of
in
service,
violation of
right.
the act. How significant a distinction is that?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought that was for you. Hard to say. I mean, whether we have a deemed granted remedy or not, we don't want to go to court. So what we had hoped we would get from a deemed granted remedy is that there's a marker down there, and most localities would try to meet it. And if 60 days or 90 days goes by and they're working on our application, we're talking to them, with or without a deemed granted remedy, we're not going to run to court. I'm sure that Sprint views it the same way. Again, we don't want to litigate with the people we're trying to serve. What we have seen with Section 6409, where there is just part of the 2012 Spectrum Act, where under certain limited circumstances there is a deemed granted remedy, is that it brought a lot of compliance. Again, no one necessarily wants to do anything on day 90 or what have you, but it kind of narrowed the scope of the disagreement, and we could all get things done within a reasonable period of time. And so for us, I think the idea of a deemed granted remedy was just to do that, to kind of lay down a marker, and that it would take care of an awful lot of the cases. You would never get to a deemed granted or a fight about it. Without it, we'd have to go to court. Arguably would have had to go to court anyway. That's dicey. We don't want to do it. We don't want to spend the money to do that. We don't want to sue the cities that we're trying to work with to convince them that 5G is going to be great for them and their constituents. And I don't know. It remains to be seen. I think it was, like I said, more of a marker than anything else, that it brought a lot of compliance, that most of the localities have tried to come within whatever the particular shot clock was.
Jared, I skipped over you. Any particular reactions to the pending item?
Yeah, it does seem positive. We have projected that we're somewhere in the low 100,000, well, maybe 100, 200, 300,000 cell sites now, depends on who you ask. We see a need for about 1 million for 5G coverage over the next few years. So anything that can make that more streamlined, we think is crucial. And there are differences around the world, as you pointed out. And so we do tie it back to, if there are multiple inputs to making 5G work. There's spectrum, there's the need for devices. But in the U.S., as opposed to some other countries, we have this setup where there are the potential for many different looks at how you deploy cell sites, and anything that can make that easier is a positive thing.
And how close is Ericsson to that whole process? I mean, I think of the carriers as being the ones out there building networks. You guys are building the equipment. How
So
does it
we
really
will have, we work together, and we'll have our crews. There are multiple crews out there, but we'll have our crews. We foresee the need for, as a job creation issue, and interestingly enough, we do foresee the need for quite a few more crews over the next several years So, you know, we're looking at more jobs. So 5G isn't just about the, you know, the services that'll be enabled and these great new things that will, you know, lead to more employment, we hope, around the world, but also just jobs and just directing these things. So, you know, so yes, we work hand in hand, but we have our own crews, and sure, they have their own crews as well.
Right. Let's turn to the BDAC. Andy and Charles mentioned it briefly, the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, which the FCC stood up to help inform their work in this area. And Charles and Andy are both on the BDAC. How's it going?
How's it going? Well, the BDAC has been a very enlightening process, I'd say. I think the positive things about the BDAC is that it has brought together a really wide and diverse range of folks who have a lot of different perspectives, and we've been forced to sit down and talk to each other at great length, and I think we've both learned things from that process. You know, as we have worked through issues, we have found that we generally can agree on a lot of principles. You know, but then we always reach that point where, well, you got to make a cut, and that's always it's that last part that is the hard part. And I think that one of the things that the commission has done here is, frankly, they've made the hard, okay, here's a hard cut. Now we're going to give you flexibility, guys, on each side of it, but here is a place where this is a marker in the sand, and now you guys go work together. And one of the things that I think both Andy and I have recognized is that we do have to work together. There does have to be a cooperative arrangement. It's not as if the FCC says, you know, if day 90 comes along, I'm not going to roll a truck out and drop a tower, because I know the city is going to be outraged, and there are a lot of other things that can go wrong. So I'm not going to be doing it that way. And everyone recognizes that. We have to have a cooperative relationship. The BDAC did do a great job of bringing issues to the surface. We didn't always get as far as we hoped we would, but I think it was a productive process.
Andy, what do you think?
I agree. It was a very heavy lift, by the way, and a number of us took many hours over the last year to get together and to work at a pretty dizzying pace at times to come up with recommendations that would help make this world a little bit better, help get broadband out to more people. And we absolutely learn from each other. We sometimes when you're down in the trenches with somebody and you're really working hard on these things, you learn how to communicate, and you learn how to agree and disagree, and you learn how to save your powder for the real big stuff, where the little stuff maybe you've been holding on to too long, and that maybe that in itself is a barrier. And so we've learned a great deal. It's been very educational. I've made some tremendous friends through the process. I've been able to spread maybe a new version of this world to cities around the country, because I've been part of it. And I think that's maybe helpful in some cases. The BDAC's been a fascinating process to be part of, and you know, we've learned a lot, and we've had a lot of ahas, and I think you have a question in here somewhere where you're going to ask us about some of those, and we'll maybe give those to you. But you know, I think we'll all be glad when it's done, and I think we'll look back and we'll be glad that we all invested the time we did to be part of it.
Well, I know it's been a lot of work for the members of it, so thanks to you two in particular and the other members of the BDAC, because I know you've got day jobs too, so I know it kept you busy. Well, go ahead and give me some ahas. What were the
Yeah, well, so, you know, one of the things, and I think Charles was actually part of this because we were talking, one of the groups that he and I served on together was the State and Local Barriers Group. I also served on the Municipal Model Code and the Rates and Fees Group. But in the Barriers Group, we started to talk about, I think it started with the moratoria discussion. And we did a little bit of digging, and we said, well, why does this really happen? And we came up with a handful of things that were lacking. Lack of knowledge, lack of understanding, lack of agreement, right? Lack of the ability to get agreement. I had some of these written down. Lack of process, lack of flexibility. Some of these lack of type of things, it almost became a cadence to us and made its way into the main body of the document for barriers, that these are different reasons why these barriers exist. They are root causes for the barriers. And that became an aha for me as we started to look at that and say, this isn't about Charles being bad and Andy being good, or vice versa, right? This is about some things in the process that are fundamentally broken, that if we address those and work on those and fix those, it's going to get significantly better. And I think these lack of statements really begin to enlighten us as we move forward and begin to work more in partnership and say, okay, so
Yeah.
is that antenna the size, or is that box the size of a pizza box or a refrigerator, right? I went out to the floor earlier today to look and see if I could identify refrigerators and pizza boxes. And I saw them both, and so I'm totally confused now. And if anybody in the audience has any guidance for me, I'm very willing to take that.
Well, I mean, Andy's example on barriers is a good one, because as we went through that discussion, and specifically we were trying to find a way, can we resolve the moratoria question? And it was a good revelatory discussion from both sides. So from my side, from the carrier side, I always tend to think about the world from Sprint's perspective, I mean, shockingly. And I think about, well, Sprint's got, I've got to deploy tens of thousands of these things across tens of thousands of jurisdictions. I've got to have a regimented system to get that done, or else it's just not going to get done. But then I didn't think about, for example, but all 4 carriers are trying to do that, and then a city is getting requests from 4 different carriers to all do their own thing, and that's very confusing to the cities. And so, on that side, I was like, that's true. I didn't look at it from that perspective. But on the other hand, I think there was an aha on the other side where I also gave the example, well, but we also frequently have a situation where the city is demanding a certain fee structure that's irrational, and they're basically imposing a moratorium until such time as you will agree to that fee structure, which is just an inappropriate use of negotiation strategy, basically.
So elephant in the room again, right?
Yeah. So it was a very good way. Again, I don't know that I don't think we ever reached resolution on that particular piece of paper.
No, probably not.
but it was a good discussion.
So let me just make an observation. When the FCC created the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, it was intended to try to bring together representatives of the major stakeholder groups to actually force them to sit down, talk to each other, try to reach consensus on what were the issues, what were potential remedies, where could consensus be achieved. And to be perfectly honest, I don't think that anyone ever expected that the parties would be able to reach consensus on every
It was
issue.
just for entertainment. You just had to sit in the cage and watch.
No, but I think
Gladiator thing.
But I think that at the end of the day, people did learn from each other, and we ended up the committees generated some very useful information. And if you look at the draft item, you'll see that it refers repeatedly to BDAC reports. And as Andy mentioned before, we adopted this sort of structure of fees, or the framework for fees in the order. And similarly, in the 60 and 90-day shot clocks are consistent with recommendations from BDAC. So from my perspective, I'm extremely grateful to Andy and Charles and the others who put in literally hundreds of hours trying to reach consensus, because I do think that it helped illuminate the problems and in some cases identify some solutions. So thank you.
So we've just got a couple minutes, but we've sort of gotten some aha moments from a couple of you. But Tamara or Jared, anything sort of in this whole process where you're thinking about an issue differently than you might have a year ago or two?
Well, I certainly know a lot more about these things than I did a year or two ago. I think the thing that strikes me over and over again, at the risk of repeating myself, is how hard this is and how many interests have to be balanced. That even within Verizon, there are folks in the company who wanted us to push the FCC to go as far as it could in this order, and there are other folks in the company saying, look, I'm sitting down with Mayor so-and-so tomorrow, our CEO is meeting with this governor next week, we're making progress. We need to be able to continue to do that. Don't screw this up for us by ticking everybody off. And sometimes it would be the same people saying those two different things. And, one week I'm supposed to call out the outrageous fees being charged by City X, and like, oh, no, they're talking to us now. We have to. So it's really challenging. And I think what it comes down to is, and I think the draft order recognizes, is we don't have a choice if we're going to be able to deploy small cells on the scale that we need to. We have to be in these municipal rights of way. We have to attach to structures within them. And we're willing to pay for that, but we can't pay $2,000 a pole. But on the other hand, and this is something that's very interesting that you said, that maybe we haven't done a good enough job on, or we haven't done it in enough places yet, explain why the services that we're going to provide over this infrastructure are really good stuff for, whether it's a smart city application, a public safety application, education, transportation, you name it, that these are things that we want to demonstrate are going to change the way we live, the way we govern, the way we do all sorts of things, and we want to do it in a way that convinces these cities to buy our stuff. I mean, these are our customers, and ticking them off is not in our interest. So to try to come up with a framework for having some sort of guideline, some sort of baseline that the FCC is trying to do in this order, while recognizing that before, during, and after the order, we're going to be sitting down with the leaders in these municipalities every day to talk about all these things. Moratorium is a good example. I think we recognized that a lot of cities just weren't prepared for this new thing. Are they pizza boxes or are they refrigerators, and you want to do how many and where and how fast? And I think the important thing for carriers is to sit down and say, well, can we work with you on a process for these? Is there a way we can submit them as batch applications where all of these will be within a mile of each other? They will all have the same form factor. They will, what are the things that we can, how can we make some checklists? How can we help you develop a process? And we're not going to go running to court screaming about a moratorium. We're working with you on that. So, maybe it's not much of an insight, but this is hard stuff, and it really requires a lot of work from all sides, and this FCC order doesn't change that at all. It's going to continue to be an iterative process. We're going to be continuing to work with local officials and trying to, build these networks and hopefully, provide service that everybody loves.
Jared, we're about out of time, but I'll give you the last word.
Just really quickly, I did talk to our guys and asked them, what is this new world like in deploying all these small cells? And their reaction was, it's the sheer complexity of it. It just is staggering. And so they're happy with anything that can add some uniformity to the processes. So from that point of view, I think it's just that realization is just the staggering amount of work that we're looking at over the next few years. And another point I wanted to make, going to the pizza box versus refrigerator thing. So I do urge you to come by our booth. The nice thing is that we do take aesthetics into account when we design our products. And so they're, the happy accent of, higher bands of spectrum, meaning you can get away with smaller antennas, holds true. And also we are designing them to look good, or not bad anyway, not the monstrosities that we're used to, specifically for poles and for light standards.
Jared, if you gave away pizza, we would definitely come to your.
Come by.
Well, this has been great. I think the one thing I've decided is we just need to reformulate the BDAC, and it's going to consist of you 5. And you'll get it all solved. Right?
Sounds good to me.
Thank you all. Please join me in thanking the panel.